We've looked at the status of doctors and trust and confidence in doctors and a whole range of other professions on behalf of the BMA. We've also looked at whether or not people feel doctors are ready to take much more management responsibility in the running of the National Health Service.
And what did you come up with?
I think what the survey shows, as this time series has since the early 1980s, is that basically doctors are the most trusted profession in the United Kingdom, and while others have gone up and down, particularly politicians, they are right up there in the public's affections. And although they're slightly less confident in their ability to actually manage the NHS as opposed to deliver clinical care, actually about 2 out of 3 almost would be reasonably confident in GPs taking a much more prominent role in commissioning and indeed in the management of some local services.
So does that go against the fears then that the way that things will develop will damage the patient-doctor relationship?
I think what you're seeing in the survey, of course, is people's confidence and trust in their GP. It's a one-to-one relationship. These people are, authoritative figures in many people's lives. They're somebody who always, tells you like it is, and therefore there's quite a lot of confidence that they could do these things. I think the concern of some members of the BMA and others is that actually, in reality, they didn't set up to go and run large, multi-billion organisations like the National Health Service. And the question is, one question for this conference, and indeed which will go on after this, is if clinicians become managers and have to take rationing decisions that are often made by politicians, does that mean that the status or the way in which people regard GPs in Britain and doctors generally, will that change?
So we should be clear that the survey was partly for the BMA and also for the Department of Health. What other details were you looking at? Well,
the work that we've done for DH over the last decade shows that people are pretty positive about the National Health Service. Over the last decade, there's been rising satisfaction. Some of the non-users more recently have picked up some of the turbulence and discussion amongst the professions and have become a bit less confident, but overall more positive than a decade or so ago. The anxieties really are about the future. When we ask people in Britain what the biggest problems facing the NHS are, at a time when investment has poured into it consistently over the last decade, and no more so than today now, people are concerned still about lack of investment. And the challenge, of course, is that when you tell people, when we do surveys for NICE and we ask, should the NHS provide the drugs that work at a price that's affordable, or should they just provide the drugs that work, or should they just provide all drugs, no matter what they cost? 72% of people don't want any restrictions whatsoever on the cost of drugs. And the difficulty that the service faces, and indeed the professionals in the service face, are that obviously demand is rising, an ageing population, which is all well known, but the public isn't in the right place, and they don't like the idea of rationing. They hold dear to the idea that everything will always be available free at the point of use. And although rationing has always sort of taken place in the NHS, it hasn't necessarily taken place as overtly as it might have to do in some scenarios for the future. And either we're going to pay more for our healthcare and indeed for our social care, or something has to give. And that is a conversation that the public would really rather not have, but unfortunately it's a conversation the professionals will have to have.
So did your survey ask specific questions about unrealistic or realistic perceptions of health service?
Well, all we've done in the past is ask people, what do you think, should there be rationing? What people will say, for example, if you want some more nuances, is that they would rather only have things available everywhere in the United Kingdom, or not at all. So, while we talk about a decentralising government, a localist government, and different groups of people in different parts of the country deciding that different sorts of services are appropriate, maybe we'll have more Herceptin here or more care for Alzheimer's over here. Actually, the public have a strong belief, particularly in services like the NHS, that it should be the same, the minimum at least, should be the same everywhere. And this is where the turf war is going to come and where the tension will come. If you do want, more choice and contestability, which many people will argue drives up overall quality of service, how do you do that with a public who don't really want to have that, who want to know that somebody somewhere will guarantee that everything will be all right and it will all be the same everywhere? And the difficulty in all of this is that the public aren't unreasonable, but very often with our political system in Britain, it's easier for politicians not to have those really difficult conversations, and because they're all playing for the crowd, they want that middle ground, middle Britain vote in order to secure power. Telling uncomfortable home truths is not an easy way to get elected.
Has the public's opinion of the role of doctors and their own role, if you like, their own responsibility changed at all?
I think that the challenge for doctors and other medical professionals is that the public's ideas about the health service are essentially that it's comprised of GPs in large white boxes called hospitals, and you go to them when you're ill. Now that's a cruel way of putting it, but effectively that's what it is. And persuading the public to treat their body like a car, you know, if you bought a car, you wouldn't expect it to sort of run without being maintained for 100 years and all be fine. But some people do actually think their bodies are going to work like that. And particularly as technology and drugs move on, we know so much more. We have to persuade people to change their behaviours. And that, as much as all of the rationing and other structural changes we need to make, is probably the biggest challenge the NHS faces today.